When we started this series, the first thing that we talked about was, what kinds of emotional pain are we addressing? There's a big difference between an argument between siblings or husband and wife that causes emotional scars. There's, things where we say maybe things that we shouldn't say to each other that leave wounds. And those can be wounding, no doubt. But we were wanting to go a little bit deeper and talk about those things that are really unexplainable on this earth. Why is it that a gunman, a kid, a mentally disturbed kid, can go into Sandy Hook Elementary School and gun down children at will? Why is it that 3 young ladies were held captive in Cleveland and chained to their beds? Why is it that 1 in 5 girls in the United States will be sexually abused? Why is that? Why is it that 1 in 10 or 1 in 20 little boys will be sexually abused? There's a lot of statistics that say that as dysfunction and woundedness carries on, that it actually repeats itself in future families. So there's a 30% chance that if someone was abused, that they will be an abuser, that they'll abuse someone else in their family. And so we started to ask the question, these things cause wounds. We can't have a congregation of this size and believe that all of us are exempt from those things, because we're not. That there's probably a lot of things that folks here have been through that were very painful. And so week 2, we talked about, okay, so what has that done to us? What are the wounds that we carry around? What are some identifiers that we are carrying around some wounds? In Matthew chapter 15, and we're not going to have this on the screen, but I just want to read it for you. Matthew chapter 15, verse 18, Jesus says this. He says, "But what comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart, and this defiles a person." He says, "For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, slander." He reminds us that it's that emotional woundedness inside of us and that sin inside of us that comes out in the things that we say or the way that we treat others, that bleeds out of us. And so some of the signs of heart trouble, some of the signs that you've been wounded may be that you don't let anyone close to you anymore. That you put up some walls and you'll be casual acquaintances of folks, but you'll never allow someone into the inner part of your life because you've been wounded. There was a case that I told you about where a young lady grew up in a neglective, abusive situation. Her parents were addicts, and that when she was getting ready to be married, that she struggled with, this need to be perfect at everything and please her future spouse in every way, because she wanted to make sure that he didn't abandon her. And so she was very needy and always, am I doing everything okay? Are you mad at me? Why didn't you call me 10 times today? And, she was just over the top needy, and it was driven from that past neglect and abuse and the damage that had been done to her. And so there were signs of heart trouble, emotional heart trouble. Last week, we started to talk, and we just really touched the top of the iceberg here about how to begin healing from deep emotional wounds. And do you remember what they had to do to my wounds? Last week I told a story about me having a nice wreck on a skateboard. And do you remember what they had to do to my wounds? Had to clean them out, right? That I had to uncover, expose those wounds, and then allow other folks to cleanse those wounds. They had to, pour peroxide on them or iodine on them. They had to, scrub out the cinders. Man, it was painful. But that pain has to come in order for healing to take place. And so we talked about that emotionally as well. Jesus said this. He said, "I have come into the world as a light, so that no one who believes in me should stay in darkness." The reason I share that scripture is because I believe that it's possible for people to be sitting in churches all across our nation and be going through the motions of church, but holding on to those wounds that are so deeply ingrained in them that they're not going to ever allow that they're not going to expose that. They're not going to allow that to be healed. They're just going to keep it deep inside and allow that to fester for the rest of their lives. And that's still holding on to that darkness. And so today I thought what we would do is take some time to hear about a real story of abandonment and how that affected a person's life. One of my toughest questions, and I really, as I started this series, I got to be honest with you, I was a little bit afraid because I wasn't sure what this would dig up for folks, what kinds of things would come of this, but I knew I needed to do it. And one of the questions that I began to ask myself, and in fact I've seen this question even asked, I think, on social media, is can you receive healing for any wound? In other words, are there people out there who have had those horrific things like we've talked about, the most horrible things imaginable? Have those folks who have experienced those things, are there any of those folks who have received complete healing and no longer are cursed by those wounds? And so today I want to invite Tim to come up. Let's give Tim a round of applause. You guys know Tim. He's our associate pastor, and as we talked over these past few weeks, it became very clear to us that he had some powerful things to share in his own personal story that it will be. Yeah, they'll get you. So Tim had some experiences growing up that were very unique, and so we're going to talk about this a little bit today. So Tim, why don't we start out by just talking about where you grew up and a little bit like what your family was like early on. Are we on?
I think so.
Is it? Hey, check the unit. Is it spinning? Does it need unplugged and plug back in? Yeah.
There we go. What was the question? I'm old.
Yes, you
What
are.
was it like growing up? What was it like growing up?
Yeah. What was it like growing up? What was your family like?
Again, I said some of this before. So I was born in Columbus, Ohio, Grand Hospital. I'm 65 years old.
Wow.
Yeah. Did that come from my family? And through a situation of abandonment, I was raised by my grandparents for the first 9 years. We lived down on South 4th Street in South Columbus, and my dad was gone. I'll get to that a little bit, but my mom was there, and my two sisters. So raised by my grandparents until I was age 9, and then my mom saved up enough money as a single mom to buy a house, which was like impossible in the 50s. So we moved up to the north end of Columbus. But my dad had left before I was born. I have a half sister, which I didn't know about until I was 16 or 17 years old. And my mom finally told me about her because it was like, well, you better know you have a half sister in case you meet this woman and you guys can't be messing around. If something happens. So she's out there, okay? So I have a half sister who had a very, very bad life because of my dad abandoning her also. She finally moved to Chicago, got passed around some family, got sexually abused, so she's had a very, very tough life. But growing up, again, from being born to age 9, I saw my dad about 2 or 3 times. And that was just for a few minutes each time. He would stop in. I didn't know this at the time, you don't know as a kid what's going on, but he'd stop in and see my grandparents, his parents, and he's asking for money, he's asking for stuff, and then he'd go and never come back for a while.
So did they tell you, Daddy's here? I mean, when you were...
No, he'd just be there.
So just like some guy off the street or some friend of the family?
Yeah, I knew who it was, but that's not...
Okay, so you did know.
I did know who it was,
okay.
From pictures or whatever, so I was like, wow, first time is like... And you don't know what to think, because usually he came around when I was in school or my mom was at work.
Okay.
So he didn't really want to see us, and he didn't really want to see my mom. But so I was like 0 to 9.
Okay. Okay.
And then from 9 to 16, never saw him at all. part of that, and I don't know all the dates, but my mom finally had told me later in life that he'd been in prison or in jail, one or the other. So he was incarcerated for a while. So that's the early years, I guess, and I can just go on.
Yeah, well, at 16, you said something in the first service about at 16 he came back and wanted.
Oh, at 16 he wanted back into our lives. He actually at that point had given his life to Christ. He screwed up for 55 years and finally accepted Christ as a Savior. So that prompted him to try to come back into our lives. And he did a few things around the house for my mom, that type of thing. Sometimes he went to the Columbus Baptist Temple up on Cleveland Avenue, so sometimes we would go to church up there, but we never, even after that, never had a relationship.
Yeah.
And my sisters did not have a relationship with him either.
Mm.
So it was like, he wasn't even like an uncle. He was like nothing to us.
So then, so after high school, then you went on to college, got married.
Mm-hmm.
What was it? How old were you when you got married?
20.
Okay.
Everybody in our family got married young, even on the Turner side. Everybody's married at 18 or 19. I mean, that was like the norm. Now I'm thinking the kids today, they just live with their parents when they're 30. It's like, wow, what's with that?
Yeah, we're saying that too.
Sorry about that. But yeah, that was, and beyond, after we got married, my sisters and I didn't have very little contact with him. Sometimes I'd visit my grandmother who was still alive. We'd see him on occasion, but not that often.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, what ways did that affect you in your married life, your family life?
I don't think it affected me. Well, I'll tell you a story later on, a little bit deeper than this, but I don't think that affected me very much. Married life or raising my own kids. But like I said, from 0 to 16, divorce was not the normal, or abandonment, of course, was not the normal in the 50s or 60s or anything like that. And going to school and all, I tried to hide it. I definitely was embarrassed that there was no dad around. Mm-hmm. So sometimes I just make up stories like, my dad's, he's a salesperson, he's just going around and that works for a while. And people finally figure out, you ain't got a dad. It's like, yeah, I ain't got a dad. So it's mostly growing up, school years, mostly I was just kind of embarrassed. Most kids in the 50s, maybe even into the 60s, there was like mother-daughter things at school or father-son things at school. It was like, I got to stay at home. Can't do that. I think my grandfather took me one time, and I love my grandfather, but that was embarrassing. Sorry, it just was.
Well, and I think it's interesting because now put that story into today's culture. I mean, all of you guys, how many of you had to go to a sports banquet? With your kids. I mean, you go to those sports banquets and different recognition things, and you're like, you don't think about that. You don't think about the fact that some of those kids may be being raised by grandparents or an aunt or an uncle because of stuff that's gone on in their families.
Right.
Yeah.
And my dad, he never contributed anything to my mom or to the kids, not one penny all those years. Never received anything from him later on in life. No apologies. I'll get to that later, but there was no apologies. My mom was a saint. At least I think she was a saint. Yeah. She raised us. She worked at Timkins for 35 years, only missed one day of work. Just amazing. And to raise 3 kids basically on her own. My dad never worked enough to get Social Security. My mom, the saint that she was, she never said one bad thing about him her whole life. She, in fact, when he turned 65, or I guess when she had early retirement, she told him that he could get part of her Social Security she went to him and said, hey, you can qualify, blah, blah, blah. And he'd get $500 a month that way. Or he wouldn't have got anything. Just amazing.
Tell them about the birthday cards.
I would get a birthday card every year from my dad, at least for the first those first, pre-teen years type thing. And I thought, that's great, I got a birthday card from him. Then my mom told me later on in life, much later, says, those cards came from me. She would send me a birthday card and sign his name, just say Dad on it. So it's like, oh well, never got anything.
Wow, yeah. So tell us the next stage of your story there.
Well, later on, much later on in life, late 40s into my 50s, I started having these dark thoughts that would creep into my mind. They wouldn't last very long, maybe a day or two, but they would get kind of depressing, but I never told anybody about them. But the thought was, and you've heard a little bit of this before, I kept thinking, or Steve or Jessica or Frankie, they're going to leave me. Just I'll do something stupid or not even stupid, and they'll just up and leave because they can't stand me anymore. And it's like, where'd this come from? I couldn't figure it out at all. And it'd go away, and I wouldn't think about it again. And every once in a while, it'd pop back in. And then I started having the thoughts also, like, well, maybe I'll just up and leave one of these times. I'll get so fed up or whatever, something will happen. I'll just leave. I'm not going to tell anybody. I'll just leave and never come back. And it's like, where's that coming from? You just can't figure out sometimes when you have these dark moments in your life or in your thought process. And what happened was, I was at church in the mall about 4 years ago, and part of the launch team, leadership team. And a friend of mine over there, Deb, she had gone through a thing called Reformation prayer, I think is the name of it. It was like an inner healing process. And so she asked some people in the church in the mall, said, you guys want to be a part of this process? Does anybody need things that need to be healed, like that? So she comes around and asks me, and I said, nope, I'm okay. And she asked me the next Sunday would come over and says, you want to be a part of this? We got some people coming, and ask you again. Nope, don't think so. I'm pretty well. I'm pretty normal. And nothing from family on that one either. All of us are a little bit, So about the third time she asked me, I said, oh, geez. I said, okay. I didn't say okay. I said to Mom, I said, oh crap, I have to do this. That's all. It's like, okay, I'll do it. I'm not going to get anything out of this, but I'll just go along to get along. So it was and it can be shorter than this, but it was a 10-week process every Saturday for 2 or 3 hours at Deb's house. And you go through these exercises, and it gets pretty intense. It gets down to your root cause of what's going, what could be a wound in your life. And first couple, 2 or 3 sessions, nothing wrong with me. And I don't know what happened. Like that 4th session, I don't even know what it was about. It was like, the light clicked on. I've got a problem, an unresolved problem. And it's this, why did I have these dark thoughts? And finally, working through a process, it's abandonment. That was my issue that was haunting me deep down inside, that would cause these dark thoughts to happen. And this process is so intense that you write things down, and one time it was like, I don't know, late, maybe the 8th or 9th session, you write it down, it's just let out your emotions. Tell me what you really feel about your dad. And it just comes spilling out on paper. And Deb said, now you got to tell everybody what you wrote down. It is intense. Of course, everybody, then you get the feeling, well, everybody else is going to do this. And it's like, okay, I'm ready to go. And then you just spill it out. And it was such a healing process when you go through, when anybody goes through that. Whether it's something, physical, sexual abuse, neglect, whatever is in your life that's, could be deep within or could be somewhat on the surface. There's something I needed to be healed of. Something that had been bothering me for years, and it was under the radar, so to speak, until it started coming out with these different thoughts. But and then I tell you, I was healed. Don't have those thoughts anymore. I never will have those thoughts anymore.
And so, one of the toughest questions I asked Tim, and it's interesting that I kind of, I guess, assumed the answer before you told me. And so I asked him this question. I said, well, did you ever forgive your dad? I mean, he said he wasn't mad at him. He said he never really hated him or anything. But did you forgive him? And so, share that.
Well, there's a two-part answer to that. The first part of the answer was no, I didn't forgive him. I'll get to that in a little bit. My sisters never forgave him. Not that it's not that we hated him. We all felt the same way. We didn't know him. He was a zero to my life. He didn't add anything to my life other than being my biological father. That was it. So I never forgave him. He died in 1999, and it kind of bugged me. But when I got to this process of this reformation prayer, I knew what I had to forgive him, even though he's passed on. And I've read people who have done that. Whether somebody's alive or dead, you need to forgive them if they've hurt you and wounded you. So I did that. So that was part of the healing process in my life. My advice to you is don't wait until somebody's died to go forgive them. Don't wait. You need that healing sooner rather than later. You point toward the bread? Oh, sorry. I got to get my glasses out to read this. Now, Dad had, down through the years, starting in the probably mid-'80s for another 10 years, he'd write letters every once in a while. And kind of cryptic, but it was always the same thing. I'm going to be coming in some money pretty soon, and I'm going to take care of your mom and all that. It's like, well, it never happened. We never did believe that, even though he was a Christian at this point. But this is one of his letters, and I didn't forgive him, remember, but he asked for it. He says, I ask all of you to forgive me for my many failures, and that includes your mother. And he would say this in these 3 letters, and some of them got even more down to it than that. And then he adds this, we all need to follow and obey God's word. Well, boy, I didn't do it. And I should have. But for somebody you haven't forgiven, you need to do it sooner rather than later.
Tell us the story that you wanted to tell here.
The lesson from my cousin Danny, who was one of my best friends growing up. He was a year older than me. Danny was abandoned by his mom and dad. Yeah, I don't think that's too harsh. Excuse me, by his mom. His dad had died when he was right after he was born, I think, soon after. And I think my other aunt and uncle lived out this way. They took him on, and I think he was a year old. He wasn't any more than 2 years old when Danny's mom, she had another son who was a little older, and she decided, I can't raise both, I can't do this. Financially, emotionally, I cannot do this, so she gave Danny away. That's a type of abandonment. And they did the best they could to raise him. I didn't, he seemed perfectly normal to me. At some point along the line, when he was very young, probably, I don't know, preteen at some point, because his last name was Parrish, they never changed his name. It's like, okay, what's up with that? And they told him, says, your mom gave you up. So you can just kind of imagine, kind of the wounding process that would have been, although I never saw him being wounded, but seemed normal to me. And then at some point later, and I didn't know all this stuff until I was older, much older. His mom was in in enough financial shape, she wanted him back. And my aunt said no. So he was wounded again.
Yeah.
And this led, he all through life, he became a loner. He was a kind of a hermit type person. He held down work. He was a good worker and that kind of stuff, but he just almost severed all relationships with people and hardly would ever talk to anybody. Moved up to St. Louisville at some point, and he had buried a trailer of a semi in the yard, and that's what he lived in. He lived in kind of underground. And the point is he never got through his wounding. He never confronted it. He never processed that. And about 4 or 5 years ago, he died. And the best anybody can figure out, nobody really knows. He was probably dead a week or two before they found him. And there was no contact with anybody. The only thing, nobody knows for sure. I think probably the mail was piling up at the mailbox, and somebody called and they found him dead. So that's probably the worst case scenario. Not getting help for your wounds or things you've suffered from somebody else, and he suffered greatly. But again, worst case scenario. I got a verse in John 16:33 that I'd like to, and a couple other things I'd like to share with you. One of my favorite verses, it says this: "These things," this is Jesus talking, "these things I have spoken unto you, that in me you might have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but be of good cheer. I've overcome the world." And I have the Phillips translation for that.
Okay.
"These things I have spoken unto you, that in me you might have peace. In the world you will have crap." You're going to go through crap, and so a lot of people here have. Most of us have.
Yeah.
But be of good cheer. I've overcome crap.
That's true.
4 last points.
That's true.
God's not dead.
That's right.
Right? The song we sung. Our God is an awesome God. 2, He loves you and me, and He cares for us. 3, He is bigger than any problem that you have. And 4, He can heal any wound if we let Him.
Thank you, Tim. Let's give Tim a round of applause again. So let's stand, and we're going to stand and go to our time of prayer, and we're going to listen to the worship team just play softly. And I want to invite you this morning, as we're standing, if you just feel like there's some emotional wounds that maybe you've tried to forget about, tried to push down, and you're like, I'm hearing this, and I know that I'm carrying this stuff around, and I need to seek healing for it, that maybe you just take a few minutes to come up and just surrender to God as a beginning of the process. This doesn't happen overnight. You don't deal with stuff on Sunday in a half hour or an hour message or whatever, and then a few minutes at the altar, but it's the beginning of a process. And so I'm going to invite you to come down. I'm going to go down, and we're going to just lift up a few things in prayer and pray for God's healing. So come on down.